Uh, Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great pleasure that every year I have this opportunity to visit with educators that Middle East Study Center invites to the campus to learn about Iran. And I don't know how many of you have been in these annual retreats. Anybody? Okay. So, yeah, it's very interesting. People that come, the knowledge that they get, and then how they basically apply it in their students and in their environment. I'm just coming from another event, and worth mentioning it, and that is a Peace Corps volunteer reunion. As you know, in 1961, President Kennedy introduced the initiative to send young folks around the world to be basically representative of the United States, teach them, educate them, and basically try to provide some sort of information to the people around the world, especially the remote areas. And Peace Corps this year will celebrate their 50th anniversary in September. From 1962 to 1976, 1,780 American Peace Corps volunteers served in Iran. And it's interesting that 250 of them are now in Portland for their first ever reunion. When you see these people 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, now they're coming and talking about their history that they had in Iran. It's amazing to understand how the environment and the media portrays people. A group of people that went, now they have totally different perspective of that country and the people, as opposed to what we are being fed day in, day out from the media. So they're going to be tomorrow at the Persian Festival. If you happen to come back, just take the opportunity and go talk to them. We will have a tent for them, and you will probably notice them with their name tags, and you can ask questions directly. Most of them have actually used the opportunity to go back and revisit their students, the families that they lived with in remote areas in the country. And it is, it's an amazing program. I was touched by one of their volunteers almost 35, 40 years ago when I was 11 years old. And he was my English teacher. And I realized today that he has passed away. But the whole concept was a concept of friendship and peace as opposed to hostility that unfortunately now present between the two countries. What I'm planning to do in this presentation is to just do a fast track review of Iran's in the past century, in 20th century and beyond, to give you an opportunity to understand exactly what is the baggage that exists in Iran. The very first waves of westernized concepts that hit Iran is related to an Iranian constitutional revolution that happened in 1905 until 1909. And gradually the people who went toward Europe and basically visited Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy, and most of them actually spent some time in Istanbul, in Turkey as a gate to Europe. They learned the concepts of Western democracy, and they came back, and at that time Iran was basically an oligarchy, and the Qajar dynasty, they had a very repressive regime and a state. There was no constitution, there was no representation by people. So these guys brought these ideas, and that basically caused a revolution in Iran that was also influenced somehow by what was happening in Russia, which then becomes Soviet Union. In 1905, 1909, there is this uprising all over the country, and it finally ends with a constitutional monarchy that was supposed to be adhered by the king. Another event that is interestingly similar to what we know as Boston Tea Party is what happened in Iran in 1890, and that was a British company that had the concession of tobacco in Iran, tried to force everybody to pay some fee for use of tobacco or sale of tobacco or purchasing, and then the clergy system at the time opposed to that, and what they did was they basically called it, as in Islam they call it haram, which means nobody could really use tobacco for smoking and such. And because of this movement, finally the king of the time had to revoke that concession to the British company, and that's kind of the first event that you see there are hands of religious personality and religious leaders coming into political debate in Iran. There have been a lot of Americans involved in Iran, as I said, the example of Peace Corps, but even further back in 1885, Howard Baskerville, who was a Presbyterian graduate of Princeton University, he traveled to Iran as a missionary, but he became so involved that he decided to join the rebels that were fighting the constitutional revolution. And he fought with them and was killed during the constitutional revolution in Iran. There is a tomb for him in Tabriz, which Iranians also celebrate him and have tribute to him as a comrade who joined the revolution. Another person, an American who lived in Iran and contributed to Iranian education system was Dr. Samuel Jordan. He established first a high school and then a college. It's called American College. And then it was renamed as Alborz High School in Tehran. And recently, one of the Iranians who has contributed to Portland State University, Fariborz Masih, who also contributed to engineering school, he donated a sum of, I think, $3 or $4 million to UC Irvine to establish a Persian Studies Center in the name of Dr. Jordan. So this Dr. Jordan Center, Persian Center at UC Irvine, is in the name of Samuel Jordan, who went to Iran to serve and to provide the knowledge and education and service to the people. The beginning of World War II, Iran tried to stay out of the war and try to be non-alliance with any of the forces, but unfortunately Iran was kind of occupied from north by Soviet forces and from south by British forces, and the next, basically the first Pahlavi king of Iran, who, as I was talking about the Qajar dynasty. He, through a coup d'etat, took over the country. He was deposed by occupied forces and was sent to South Africa in exile. As you see in this photo, Stalin, President Roosevelt, and Churchill, they are in Tehran. There was a conference that basically put the steps for a rebuttal against German Nazis, and they sent a lot of equipment and material for the support of Russian forces from Iran to Soviet Union and then to the front lines of the war. So that's also another event that Tehran's name comes out. After sending Reza Shah to exile, the son, Mohammad Reza, who everybody in the US knows as Shah of Iran, he was basically crowned as the next Shah, even though he was very young, educated in Switzerland, just came back. He was about 25 years old. He became the king. And for the very first 10, 15 years of his monarchy, based on his weakness, personality, and some of the situation that was happening around the world, and influence again of the Soviet Revolution North, the type of government that he basically maintained was somehow democratic. And it is in that period that Dr. Mossadegh, the Iranian champion of nationalization and nationalization of oil and independent Iran, becomes the prime minister, a graduate of Sorbonne. Dr. Mossadegh basically threw out British petroleum company from the country and then became the target of all kinds of hostilities, first by Brits and then later on from United States, and eventually through a coup d'etat in 1953, CIA toppled him. This was the first coup of CIA outside basically the country. It was their first operation, covert operation. In 1953, they were able to depose Dr. Mossadegh and brought back the Shah and reinstated for 25 years the relation that, as one of Portlander's famous, our great writer and a storyteller, Terry McDonald says there was 67,000 military advisors in Iran in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution happened. That this is just the military employee. There were plenty of contractors and private advisors that were working in Iran and trying to teach the people how to live, how to read, how to eat, and so on. And basically they caused a situation that there was this unfortunate uprising that happened in Iran. And well, the uprising was not unfortunate. The outcome is somehow unfortunate. The revolution was a democratic movement inside the country. Some have said that that is basically the situation of what now we call Arab Spring had the same root as the Iranian Revolution. But I don't agree with that in that sense. Although there are some similarity, but there are for sure differences. Time-wise, 1979, we did not have access to information the way people have today through internet and through the communication systems. And also the system of governance in Iran is now totally different than what it used to be back then, or what it was a few months ago in Egypt or in Tunisia. One of the events that before the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran that caused a lot of controversy, especially between the government and the religious establishment, was something that came out of actually President Kennedy's doctrine of trying to democratize the rest of the world and try to somehow bring up the societies that were mostly farming societies. There was not much of industry and technology based. So there was these reforms that Shah introduced based on recommendation that he was getting from American foreign policy advisors. And one of them was land reform. So he decided to divide the land between the people who were working on it. And although this is a very, I guess, bright idea and good idea, in effect, it destroyed the agriculture-based society. They also tried to promote participation of workers in industries and in factories, shares. That, again, caused a lot of migration from villages to the cities without having the infrastructure that was needed. And all of these, basically, hand in hand, caused a situation that ended up with 1979 revolution. And in the middle of, I guess, misery of the people, Shah in 1970 decided to celebrate the 25th century of kingdom or monarchy in Iran and set up an elaborate festival and party that 53 or 54 head of state came to Shiraz and to Persepolis and attended this celebration, while a short walk away from those sites, there were these villages that people were living in, basically in shacks, and they didn't have water to drink. But at the same time, there was these huge parties catered from France, and there was a brilliant of tent designed by Christian Dior, and it was a major celebration. Some of you may have seen photos online about it, but they tried to basically show the world that, yeah, we have 2,500 years of history, which we do, but at the same time, nothing really reached to the bottom of the people. One of the things that happened was that, again, in the 70s, around the world, there were this wave of interest in armed rebellions. In Cuba in 1959, there was a revolution. And at the same time with Iran, there was in several different, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, there were these armed uprising. And in Iran also, these ideas became prominent in Iranian political discourse to use basically armed struggle against the Shah. And so two organizations were created at that time of mostly well-off, educated intellectuals. One of them was something that still exists. It's called the MKO Mujahideen Khalq organization. And the other one was Fadai organization. One of them was Marxist, Leninist, and the Mujahideen was basically Islamist with some Marxist views of Islam. The Islamic Revolution, when it happened in 1979, the idea basically was to bring some sort of democracy into the country. But in effect, it replaced a monarch with a religious position that is even more difficult to deal with. Now it's a theocratic state. Anything that they basically pass as a law has to comply with the religious law, with the Sharia law. Even though Iran doesn't have exact term of Sharia the way you hear it in Sunni religion, but still there are some way of living, so to speak, and religious laws that has to be maintained. And because of that, really, the will of people doesn't have much of weight against the will of God. And in this type of society, really, you're stuck between something that you cannot change, and they also try to tell you that, yeah, you have the vote, you can say, you can decide. And this contradiction has caused a lot of friction within the country and within the governing elite in Iran. What came out in 2009 of the election in Iran, and you heard Ahmadinejad's name and so on, is in effect a struggle within the Islamic Republic. It has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It's something that's happening within this system, the contradiction that exists between republic and Islamic. Whether you want to have it a democratic republic or you want to have a religious state or Islamic government. And that basically caused this whole green movement that you might have followed in the news for a few days. It was the, I guess, top of the CNN and Fox and you name it, including our own Oregonian newspaper. They had pictures of the struggle in the streets of Tehran. I like to give some information to show which society are we talking about. And for that, I have some graphs that will give you perhaps better idea. Let me try to find it. Yeah, that's.
Why don't you pause for a second?
Sure.
Just for the purpose of the audio, move your microphone down just a little bit.
Jeff, that's my voice a little bit. Oh, sorry. No, the one up there.
Oh, sure. Thank you. First, let me define the concept of MENA, Middle East and North Africa, to show you which countries are included in the series of slides that I will show, and basically tries to give you an idea of how these events of past few months happened in Middle East and North Africa, and how that relates to Iran. So it's a comparison between Iran and the Middle East, North Africa as a whole, and a couple of countries specifically I have used in my graphs. So what we call Middle East, for whatever reason, is Iran, Iraq, the whole Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and then goes all the way to Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Then the rest are considered North Africa, even though you can include Egypt in the Middle East or not. It depends on where you're standing and where is the middle. So this whole term obviously comes from people who were living in the West, so they considered us Eastern. So that's Middle East. So that tells you what the focus of the world was. These are some numbers of the population of the whole Middle East and North Africa. The number is 2010 for the 336 million people, close to 337 million. And if you consider this whole population is very close to the population of the United States. The urban population is about 58% in the whole. The GDP per capita is 3,210, and the GNI is 3,839. Obviously, the GDP and GNI in the US is something close to 37,000. So we're talking about a same population with 1/15 of the basically income. These numbers are from World Bank. And also pay attention that the GDP that we are talking about also include countries such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, which are filthy rich countries of the Persian Gulf, and they have like $47,000, $50,000 a year GDP. So these are just mixed with the rest of the region and brings it up to $3,800 gross national income. So the population of the MENA compared to Iran and Egypt. Iran and Egypt are very close, as you see. It's about 76 in Iran, 84 in Egypt, and Syria is about 26 million. The population growth over the 40, 50 years from 1960, as you see, ironically, for Iran, after this is basically where the revolution happened, Islamic Revolution 1979, and then you see that there's all of a sudden there's a drop in the growth of population in Iran after the Islamic Revolution, and especially during the 10 years of war with Iraq. Everybody was promoting. It's just like what we call here baby boomers. So that happened the same way in Iran. But shortly after that, it drops dramatically the growth in Iran to below 2%, which is, with any standard, is a great number to keep. Then the population of urban to total, again, this darker gray is Iran, the lighter gray is Egypt, the red is MENA. And as you see, it's about 69 to 70% of Iranians are living in urban area. So as opposed to the picture that I gave you from 1970s, there is a big shift of a country that was only 36% urban. Now it's more than 70, close to 70% urbanized. And obviously this urban environment has its own needs and brings its own requirement and appeals. As you know, the democracy is an urban concept. So as you get more urbanized, you're expecting more rights and more civil society. The population of the people that are 15 and less compared to the rest of the population, again, as it grows down from 1990s, in all of these countries, basically reduces. And that shows that basically the health of the society is getting better, so there are more older people living, that this percentage gradually goes down, especially if you consider that the population growth is not high in Iran. Then now you see that less than 25% are under 15 in Iran. But again, my point of showing these slides is for you to compare Iran with the rest of the Middle East. That's, again, this is the GDP per capita. These are all World Bank data for up until 2010. And as you see, again, Iran is a darker gray, is above the average for the MENA, and certainly above Egypt and Syria. I need to point out that Islamic Republic, despite all the negativity that it has and is perceived, especially in the West, it also has created an entrepreneurship inside the country, and there are plenty of entrepreneurs. The power of the middle class has increased. And that is another reason that you are not seeing the same Arab Spring happening in Iran. What is happening in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia? I constantly face these questions from Iranians or non-Iranians that they're asking me why this is not happening in Iran. Well, first of all, this happened in Iran in 2009, but the reason it faded down is because the stability is the interest of majority of people. If you have a society that most of the people are involved in the economy, they cannot afford more than 6 months of shutdown. When Islamic Republic happened in 1979, the majority of people who didn't go to work, they were working for government. So it was government who was suffering. The oil industry was totally government owned. So when that shut down, then the government collapsed. But in these societies, these are people, regular people, that are going to be suffering of prolonged strikes or prolonged struggles. Similar with GNI. I don't know if you guys know the difference between GNI and GDP. Anybody who wants to have a shot at it? The GDP is gross domestic product, and then the GNI is gross national income. The difference is that when you're talking about GDP, you're talking about what is the total income inside the country. So if you have a stock of, say, Sony in Japan, that is not counted. What is the product of USA divided by the population? That's the GDP per capita. But we may have a lot of interest in Europe, in Africa, in everywhere else. The total income when is divided by the number of people, that's the GNI. And the difference here between GNI and GDP shows that in some of these countries, and most of the Middle East and North African countries, they really don't have much interest outside their region. But in some of those, like in Saudi Arabia, in United Arab Emirates, and Qatar and Kuwait, because there are these kingdoms, in a sense, sheikdoms, that they have lots of money, they invest outside the country. You have many corporations in the US that are owned by Arab sheikhs from United Arab Emirates, including part of News Corporation of Fox that is owned by one of the sheikhs from Dubai who owns it. So any interest outside the country also comes in when you use GNI. The health expenditure per capita, again, as you see in Iran, the case is much higher than the MENA on average, and you see how low is the health expenditure in Egypt, and especially in Syria. In Syria, that would probably explain a country that is, in some sense, there are some socialist concepts in the government of Syria. There are some like free education, free health, and so on. But the expenditure is very low compared to the rest of the Middle East. Yes?
What is this giant drop? What is that? In health expenditure?
Yeah, this, I'm not sure what happened in 2000 that has this effect. 2001. Well, obviously that's when the war happened. That's 2001, is right after 9/11, and I don't have any specific to suggest, but yeah. And then for Iran, if you look, and basically I had some other slides that tells you from 1995, when the sanctions on Iran was imposed by President Clinton, some of these economic malfunction really had started from then and continues to be the problem. Life expectancy, it's very close in all these 4 countries and the region, is around 70 years. And here you see that Syria is above all of them. So even though they spend less than the rest per capita, they have a more life expectancy. So maybe the food is good. Similarly, for female, the same thing. Well, the difference is that, no, there's really not much difference between the average of the society compared to female life expectancy. Public spending on education, again, the Iranian expenditure on education is higher than all the other 3 indicators that I've used. The number of girls to boys in elementary and high school is about equal, except for Iran is exceeding now. Both number of girls is exceeding the boys in K-12 as well as in higher education. Also, the number of girls is going above the 100% of men. The literacy rate is about 83-4% in Iran and in Syria, but it's below 70% in Egypt and the average of the MENA. Yes, sir.
Do you have any information about the ratio of the population, males to females overall? Are there a higher number of women in Iran today, and does that correlate to the higher number of girls in school?
I don't have it here, but if you go to World Bank, this website, you can get indicators for any country you want, and it will just draw the graph for you. So that's a great tool for your education purposes if you want. They do have indicator for men population, female population, and total. I did not use it for a graph. Yeah, this is the female to male in higher education. Again, on average, the whole Middle East and North Africa is doing pretty well. It's about 94%. In Iran, it is much higher than 100%, which shows that females' numbers are more than male. This is a comparison between female to male in higher education.
So how would you explain that there's so many more women now?
The explanation is very complicated. The reason is that I don't have any specific data that explains it, but there are my personal speculation. One is that because there are not many people absorbed by workforce, and they are going through a kind of like a private apprenticeship or entrepreneurship. They sometimes don't need, the men don't need to be educated as much as women need. And for women, getting to this higher level has become a struggle against the government and oppression. So there are more women that they want to prove that they can be as good as men and even better. So there are many women going to higher education in Iran. Unfortunately, the percentage of employment is not consistent with this number, which shows that women get their higher education degrees, but they're not absorbed to the workforce. And obviously, there are some society reasons, the social norm that cause this, but comparative to the rest of the Middle East, Iranian women employment is much higher. But this is interesting that, yeah, they have so much, they have a higher rate of going to higher education. About 64 to, I think, percent of people in higher education are from Iran. But I like to also point to this decline at the end, and this is a government decision to bring down the number of girls in higher education. The Ahmadinejad government has now enforced a policy of in certain universities or certain fields not to accept as many women in colleges as they accept men. Or that's interesting that in all of the world we have this promotion of female involvement in education and in workforce, and in Iran it's the opposite. They are trying to make 50-50 in some field. Although there are more women being accepted or being qualified to go to that field, they're trying to mechanically bring it down to 50-50, which is a kudos to women of Iran, I guess. This is a, I don't know how you, you can interpret it the way you wish. That's the number of Iranian women, the female parliamentarians in different countries. And this is actually the percentage. So you see that in Syria, they're like 12.5% of their representatives are female. In Egypt, it's less than 2.5%, and in Iran is about 2.73%. But on average, again, it's pretty impressive for the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, especially if you consider that in many of these countries there is no parliament. In United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Kuwait, there is no. Yes?
I was going to say, so with this being percentage, so when you say like 12.5%, does that mean one person out of 60? Or, I mean, how does that?
Well,
are we talking hundreds of people, thousands? How big is the parliament within these countries?
well, when we say percentage is because, exactly because the number of members in parliaments are different. So, for example, in Iran, it's like 380 parliamentarians from different. So 3% of that is like 10 and 12. These are some indicators to show how developed these different countries are. And these are all indicators that World Bank is using basically to show which country is using it more. So in electric power consumption per capita, again, Iran is more than other countries of the region. And that also shows why Iran is eager to find a way of producing more energy. Even though it's a country that produces oil and gas, it is still lagging in producing electricity. Yes?
Is there domestic consumption? Is it primarily oil? Is it hydro? Is it a mix?
Mix, but mostly oil. But there are some dams that they use for hydro, and they haven't had the nuclear one operational just yet. I've been told that there's also a move toward wind and solar as an alternative. But as with any other country, the percentage of alternative energy use is still very low compared to oil and gas. I think somebody was talking about cell phones. I don't know. So these are, these are the numbers of mobile phone per 100 people, which is above 70 for Iran, Egypt, and the average in MENA. It's about 45 to 50% in Syria. Similarly, internet access is in Iran is about 37%, and then for the rest is about 22, 23%. Again, these shows somehow the development of the country as well as the connection between the people and outside world. And these are all, I guess, good indicatives that the ceiling is not going to be closing anytime soon when people have access through internet or through mobiles. I think I have two of these. Okay. That's the indicators that I had to show you. I think we can, what time is it? How much time I have used? I've used a lot.
If you want,
I would like, maybe I can ask Juvin to start, and then we get QAs after his presentation. How's that sound?